Listen up, y'all. If y'all love true crime stories from murders, cold cases, missing people, or just crazy stories that will have you just shaking your head, subscribe to patreon.com/celebrity underrated for exclusive content to get those type of stories. That's patreon.com/celebrity underrated, or just click the link in the description. You know, if there's one series that I hope 50 Cent do in the future on his platform, I hope he do the Chris Lighty story. Him and Chris Lighty were good friends and business partners that changed the game and made a lot of money together, y'all. 50 Cent said when he lost Chris Lighty, he lost brain management. Chris was the brains when it came to handling business. Chris Lighty is the definition of street smarts and book smarts. His networking, his communication skills were incredible when it came to business and doing deals. If any of his artists got in trouble with the law, he would bail them out or go to court to make sure they was all right. Chris Lighty took care of his artists and got them more money than what they was worth. And he's been doing it since the 80s, making his clients multimillionaires. He was a master negotiator when it came to making deals. He has over 100 million in combined album sales and millions of dollars in brand-related ventures. Forbes magazine named him as one of the industry's most influential talent managers. In the streets, he was known as Baby Chris, the gangster. But in the business world, we all know him as just Chris Lighty, the businessman. But his death is still a mystery to a lot of people. A lot of his close friends and family members don't believe he killed himself. Some really think he was murdered and imply that it may have been the doing of someone very close to him. So let's get into the story of Chris Lighty, right? Now, Chris Lighty was born on May 8th, 1968 in the Bronx, New York. And he was the oldest born of 6 kids from his parents. Now, by the age of 6 years old, his mother and father split up, leaving Chris, the man of the house, to watch over his younger siblings. But his mother made sure that they all had the best education, and she put Chris in a private school. And Chris would have to fight every day because he was the only black person in his school. Now, growing up in the Bronx, he witnessed the birth of hip hop. He was at the park jams and saw how the DJs will hook up their equipment to the light poles for electricity to play their music. And by the time he hit his teenage years, his mother got remarried and she had to send Chris to live with another family member because she was in an abusive relationship with her new husband. She didn't want Chris to challenge him because now he was big and older enough to fight her new husband. So after graduating high school, Chris decided to study electrical engineering, and he ended up landing a good job as an electrician at the electrical company Metro North. Now, also around that time, Chris and his crew started to hit the clubs, and they met legendary DJ Red Alert. And Chris had actually told Red Alert that they were sent to him from Africa Bambaataa in the Zulu Nation, in which Red Alert knew was a lie. But Chris had told DJ Red Alert that him and his crew would be his muscle and protection if he could get them in the club for free. And DJ Red Alert agreed because sometimes he would have problems with rappers who were bitter when their record wasn't played by him. But Chris and his crew will also help carry all his vinyl records for him to the clubs where he would DJ at. Now, Another thing is, Chris and his crew were also known and had a reputation for fighting and beating up people all through New York City. They called him Baby Chris because he was the baby of the crew and was nice with his fighting skills. And for some reason, everybody wanted to fight him because he was a pretty boy. They say him and his boys would take your girl right in front of you in the club. Wow. And DJ Red Alert gave them the name the Violators because they would violate you if you started with them. You know, during that time, a lot of the rappers had gangsters that rolled with them anyway. Eric B. and Rakim used to roll with the Supreme Team and the original 50 Cent. You know, Big Daddy Kane had his Brooklyn crew with him all the time. KRS-One had BDP and so on. But you know, also around that time, DJ Red Alert nephew Mike G from the Jungle Brothers had asked Red Alert to help him and his boys to make a song. They wanted to make a hip-hop song. And that's when Red Alert took them to the studio and they made this song called Jimbrowski. And the Jungle Brothers ended up getting a record deal with Warlock Records. Now, Red Alert didn't have time really to look after them because he was busy doing what he had to do, was DJing and managing other artists. So that's when he brought Chris in the picture because he felt Chris was the most level-headed and business-minded out of his crew. He just saw something in Chris. You know, he was more focused, he was more mature, and like Chris had a mission in life. And he made Chris the Jungle Brothers road manager because he knew Chris would take all the duties and help them become successful. Then, you know, De La Soul got down, he became their road manager. Then the Tribe Called Quest got down and hired Cool DJ Red Alert as their manager. He was their first manager, and Chris became their road manager. Now, around 1988, Chris and Shakim had formed Violator Flavor Unit Management. And once De La Soul released a song called Buddy, that's when the Native Tongues clique was formed, which included a Tribe Called Quest, Jungle Brothers, Queen Latifah, Moni Love, and later on some other members would join. Now, Chris's name kept being mentioned so much on records, like a Tribe Called Quest song called What? When Q-Tip rapped the line, "What's Chris Lighty if he wasn't such a baby?" That was my junk right there. That album was crazy. But you know, his name caught the attention of Leo Cohen, who wanted him to be down with Rush Management for Def Jam. Because see, Leo was a big fan of the Native Tongues, and he was a fan of KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions. And he was impressed how Chris was taking all these groups on the road and was making money. A lot of people don't know that Chris also went on the road with KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions too. Chris and Scott LaRock were real good friends, and he was actually present on that day when Scott LaRock was killed. Chris was there when Scott LaRock got killed outside the housing projects in the Bronx, in the High Bridge housing projects. Wow. He was there for that first hip-hop murder, y'all. That's crazy. Y'all make sure y'all check out that Scott LaRock story I did on the channel too. But anyway, so Leo wanted Chris to join Rush Management. And when Chris first met Russell Simmons, he really wasn't feeling him at first, because when he met Russell, it was at a club where everybody was doing drugs and getting high, and a bunch of other strange stuff was going on in the club that he didn't want to be a part of. But after Leo convinced him for the second time to join Rush Management, he agreed. Chris knew he needed to learn a lot more about the business to get the kind of money that they were making, so he took the Rush Management Def Jam offer. Now, in 1989, Chris would get his face slashed while waiting in line to get inside a club. Now, the story goes, it was Queen Latifah's birthday party in Manhattan. And you know, she had all types of guests in there. She had Bobby Brown was in there, Wesley Snipes, Chris Rock, and some other celebrities. Plus, her family members and friends were also there at that party. Now, Chris and Africa Baby Bam from the Jungle Brothers had arrived late, and they was trying to get past the line to get in. But some other guys who were waiting in line didn't like how they were skipping the line, and he pushed Chris and slashed him in the face with a razor. Next thing you know, Chris and his peoples he was with ended up beating the guys up outside the club, and the guys ended up running inside the club. And that's when Chris made a phone call to his crew, the Violators. And some of the Violators were already in the club, and then some more showed up. And when they got in the club and found the guy that had slashed Chris in the face with that razor, Chris threw him into a fish tank that was in the club, and the Violators destroyed the whole club that night, and they had to shut down Queen Latifah's party. Wow. They say when everybody was running out of the club, Queen Latifah's mother was injured through the chaos. But after the incident, that's when Leor told Chris that he needed to make the decision to leave the streets alone if he wanted to roll with Rush Management. And that's when Chris agreed to leave the street life alone and focus on the music business. So now focused on Rush Management, he started working with artists like Eric B. and Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, Public Enemy, Brand Nubians. He brought over his groups, De La Soul and the Tribe Called Quest, and many more. It was crazy because when he started working there, he found out that Leor and Russell didn't read contracts. And that's how he began to learn, because he was reading the contracts for them. And you know, one of the first groups that Chris managed on his own was the group called Black Sheep. And he helped them get a deal with Mercury Records. But then around 1992, Russell and Leor ended up shutting down Rush Management. And that's when Chris really started focusing on Violator Records and management. Because when Russell and Leor had shut down Rush Management, they told Chris to go ahead and pick any artist they had as clients for himself to manage. And that's when he signed the Brand Nubians. He took Busta Rhymes solo because he didn't want to deal with the leaders of the new school. He took LL Cool J and many more. Also around that time, he ended up getting a production deal with Relativity Records. And he signed Chi Ali, Fat Joe, and the Beatnuts. Chi Ali was the first artist he signed to Relativity Records when he was about 14 years old. But then Leo Cohen told Chris to bring Violator Records to Def Jam Records, even though Chris had already brought those artists to him and let him hear them first, and he refused. But you know how that go. Now, in 1993, Chris was the security / doorman / promoter at the Tunnel nightclub in New York after his friend Jessica Rosenblum pulled him in. And one time Chris said Tupac came to the club and he had to send him back to his car because Tupac had a weapon on him. But he said Tupac gladly went back to his car, put his weapon away, then came back and partied. And according to Prodigy from the group Mobb Deep, he said Chris Lighty and Jessica Rosenblum would be at the door and they would let them get in for free all the time, plus give them free drink tickets. Plus, he said Chris Lighty would let them stash their weapons in the bathrooms like razors, screwdrivers, and guns. Wow. That's in his book too, a Rare Prodigy book. Now, in 1994, Chris had heard the song Indo Smoke by Mr. Grimm and Warren G, which was on the Poetic Justice soundtrack. And he ended up bringing Warren G to Def Jam. And on June 7th, 1994, Warren G released his debut album titled Regulate G-Funk Era, which hit #1 on the US top R&B hip-hop albums Billboard charts, and it went certified triple platinum. Now, by them signing Warren G, that kind of rubbed Suge Knight the wrong way, even though they didn't sign Warren G to Death Row when they had the chance, but Suge still felt that Warren G was his artist. So, you know, when they were in LA at the Palace on Vine Street for a De La Soul performance, Suge Knight and his team came to approach Leor, but Chris and one of his friends had protected Leor with the gun he had on him. and got Leo back to his hotel safe. When Chris stood up to Suge, Eric B from Eric B and Rakim, Eric B was with Suge. And Chris told Eric B that he should have told Suge about how he get down. Because Eric B, you got to come back home to New York and it's going to be a problem. And once he told him that, Suge Knight and Eric B left without an incident. Then another incident he had with Suge was over Warren G's Regulate video shoot, because Suge didn't want Nate Dogg to appear in the video. So that's when Chris and his friend, they went to Suge's office. They rolled up to Suge's office to explain to him how, by them coming to an agreement, that they both can make money with Warren G and Nate Dogg on this Regulate song. And Suge had asked Chris, why was he protecting that white man, Leo Cohen, so much? And Chris told Suge that he doesn't see color. He was all about the money and business. Plus, Leo was like a father to Chris. They had like a father and son relationship. But, Suge Knight respected that. They shook hands and they did business, and the Regulate video took off. Now, in 1995, Chris helped LL Cool J with his album titled Mr. Smith, which was his comeback album that ended up going double platinum. And Chris had just hired Mona Scott to join Violator management. And we all see what she has accomplished today with the Love and Hip Hop reality series. Mona Scott getting money right now. But Mona Scott was the one that got LL and Boyz II Men to do the song Hey Lover. Plus, she was the one that introduced the producers, the Track Masters, to Chris. Now, Chris also introduced the world to Foxy Brown by putting her on the song titled I Shot Ya from that LL album. And then, Foxy released her album on November 19th, 1996 called Il Nana, which ended up going double platinum. And he also introduced Jay-Z to Leo Cohen, because Chris was the one that got Jay-Z to ghostwrite for Foxy. Jay-Z had written all her big singles on that album. And around that time, Chris' name was buzzing all through the industry, and that's when everybody wanted Chris on their team. RCA Records had made him a big offer to come to that company, but Leo Cohen literally cried and had begged him to stay at Def Jam Records. So, Chris decided to stay. In 1997, Chris landed a deal for LL Cool J to do a Gap commercial, in which LL in that Gap commercial wore a FUBU hat that launched Damon John's career, and which turned into $1 billion clothing company. In 1998, rapper DMX was one of the hottest rappers out at that time for Def Jam. DMX had heard that Chris Lighty had dissed him by saying his album wasn't all that, and he was a crackhead or something like that, right? But it wasn't Chris that said it. It was his brother, Dave Lighty, who had said it in a meeting. But all DMX heard was the name Lighty is the one that had dissed him in a Def Jam meeting. So when DMX seen him, he just sucker punched Chris in the mouth and knocked his tooth out. And Chris was so mad that he called the Violator crew to take it to the streets. He wanted to hurt DMX bad. But Leo Cohen saved DMX by giving Chris some points and royalties off the DMX next album, which was the album called Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, which ended up going triple platinum and #1 on the charts. So Chris got a real big check from that DMX incident that probably made DMX wish he never had hit him. Dave Lighty in an interview said that was the worst punch DMX could have thrown in his life because it cost him a big check. Wow, that's crazy. Now, on August 10th, 1999, Chris released the compilation album titled Violator, the album. And the first single was called Vibrant Thing by Q-Tip, which hit #1 on the Billboard Hot R&B Airplay charts. After that, Chris and Leo Cohen had a falling out over Irv Gotti because Chris felt he was too much of a loudmouth. But Irv was the new hot A&R bringing DMX and Ja Rule to Def Jam. And Leo wasn't really showing no love to Chris anymore, so Chris left Def Jam. And that's when Loud Records hired him as the executive vice president. And on July 24th, 2001, he released his second compilation album titled Violator, the album V2.0. And also around that time, he ended up meeting 50 Cent through Shy Money. And he signed him to Violator management. And you know, Chris tried to get 50 Cent a record deal, but every label was just turning him down because of his reputation. And he even brought him to Def Jam, but you know, Leo was more loyal to Irv and Ja Rule at that time, who was on fire on the Billboard chart, so that wasn't going to work. But Eminem heard 50 Cent's mixtape. You know what? The rest is history. Chris had negotiated that deal, and they was off to the races. But then, on January 16th, 2003, somebody had shot up the lobby at Chris Violator office. Now, the story goes with that incident, they say a man or men just walked up in the Violator building and let off shots, but no one was injured. Chris and some of his artists were present at the time in another room in the building, and his employees were in the office during the shooting, and they couldn't identify the shooter, nor could they tell if he acted alone or with partners. And you know, Chris' security team tried to chase whoever did the shooting, but they ended up getting away. Then, about a month later, rapper Busta Rhymes' SUV was shot up and riddled with bullets while it was parked in front of the Violator building. Now, Busta was not in the vehicle, thank God, but he and Chris, they drove the same type of car at the time. And after that incident, that's when Chris ended up getting a bulletproof vest. It's crazy because he was managing 50 Cent, and 50 Cent had so much beef in the streets at the time. Plus, just a few months before Jam Master Jay of Run DMC was just murdered. And you know, for that shooting at the office, Chris blamed Irv Gotti for the shooting at his office. And that's when Russell Simmons had to set up a meeting between Irv and Chris to squash the beef, but the beef didn't get solved. Now, what's crazy is one of Jimmy Henchman boys claimed he shot up the Violator office too. Chris and Jimmy Henchman had beef also. Some of Jimmy Henchman's former friends who turned informant had got on the stand and told the jury he was one of Jimmy Henchman's top henchmen, and stated that he shot up Chris Lighty's office in retaliation for Jimmy Henchman. You know, once Jimmy Henchman started managing the game, and then 50 Cent kicked him out of G Unit, that was more problems because the game and the 50 Cent, they had gotten to a shootout at the Hot 97 radio station. But you know, the informant stated to the jury a bunch of incidents that had happened between Jimmy Henchman and Chris Lighty and 50 Cent the G Unit. Now, it was also reported that Diddy tried to broker a truce in his office between Jimmy Henchman and Chris Lighty, but that didn't work. They ended up getting into a fight and Diddy had to break up the fight. You know what's crazy? All of this, all the court documents of the people testifying in court about the Jimmy Henchman, Chris Lighty, and 50 Cent beef is on YouTube, y'all. It's on a channel called Crown TV Courts. Y'all can check it out there. It's some crazy mess that was going on during that time. Wow. But anyway, let's get back to the Chris getting 50 Cent signed to Shady Aftermath, because on February 6, 2003, 50 Cent released his debut album titled Get Rich or Die Trying, which ended up selling today over 13 million copies as we speak. Wow, that was a big album, y'all. Get Rich or Die Trying. Now, after that, right, that same year in 2003, Chris was offered the senior vice president job at Jive Records, and the first act he signed was Mobb Deep. He had brought Mobb Deep to Jive Records. Also that same year in 2003, he released his third Violator album titled V3, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. And he also got married to his longtime girlfriend named Veronica that 2003 year. And Leo Cohen was his best man. Then he helped 50 Cent launch his G-Unit clothing company through Mark Echo. Then they put out a video game called Bulletproof. And then they launched the G-Unit sneakers through Reebok. In 2004, Chris had put together one of the biggest brand endorsement deals in hip-hop history, which is the 50 Cent vitamin water drink deal. Now, the beverage company Glasso gave 50 Cent a stake in the company and his own grape flavored vitamin water. And then Coca-Cola bought Glasso 3 years later for over $4 billion. Wow. They say 50 Cent's take was estimated to be worth up to $100 million. Man, telling you. And you know what? Chris received an undisclosed sum too. Some say he made like $10 million off that deal. Then in 2005, him and 50 Cent inked a deal to do a movie, which was to Get Rich or Die Trying, which did millions in the box office. Plus, in that same year, Chris and boxer Winky Wright formed Winky Promotions to get into the boxing world. In 2006, another group Chris managed was the group 3 6 Mafia, who ended up winning Best Original Song at the Academy Awards in 2006 for the song called It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp for the movie Hustle and Flow, which is a classic movie. I love that movie. Also that same year, in 2006, Forbes magazine named him one of the industry's most influential talent managers. In 2007, Chris ended up being sued by a Hollywood agent named Michael Ovitz. Now, this guy, Michael Ovitz, was supposed to be helping to make all Chris clients Hollywood stars, movies and all types of stuff. But Chris ended up pulling out of the deal with him because he felt he wasn't doing his job. So this guy, Michael Ovitz, he sued Chris and won. And Chris had to pay $2 million plus his lawyer fees. Wow. In 2009, he started managing rapper Soulja Boy with the help of 50 Cent. But also that same year, 2009, he lost millions of dollars investing with Bernie Madoff, who later went to prison for fraud and scamming for a total of around $50 billion in a Ponzi scheme. Now, Chris said that what he lost wasn't life-threatening, but according to his brother Dave Lighty, he said he believed his depleted account with Bernie Madoff was at one point worth $23 million. Wow. That's a big loss, y'all. That Bernie Madoff scheme, that was crazy. Now, around 2010, during the recession, Chris had to make some adjustments in the music industry because, the game had changed. Digital downloads was taking over, so the money was way less now. So he had to cut a lot of his staff and downsize everything. But also that same year, in 2010, he got a Sprite soda deal to Drake and his team, which was worth $850,000. In an interview, Chris said he passed that Sprite deal to Drake's people because he wanted to see another manager succeed. That's how Chris was. He wanted everybody to win. And he also started managing Diggy Simmons, who is the son of Rev Run and nephew of Russell Simmons, and helped him get a deal with Atlantic Records. In 2011, he launched a website called PleaseListenToMyDemo.com. And he created the website because everywhere he went around the world, everybody wanted him to hear their music. And, he also did a partnership with Primary Wave Music to create Primary Violator, which was going to be a talent management firm with his friend Blue Williams. Blue Williams used to manage the group Outkast. In 2012, he started to manage rapper Yo Gotti, and his brother Mike Lighty was his road manager. But then, on August 30th, 2012, Chris Lighty was found dead in the backyard of his South Riverdale, Bronx apartment from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Now, the story goes, on that day, right, Chris had come home early from work, and when he arrived, he saw his wife Veronica in moving trucks in front of his home. Veronica was kicking him out of his own house. Now, according to his daughter Tiffany, who had spent the whole summer with them after graduating college, she said Chris and Veronica pretty much was arguing and fighting the whole summer. So Tiffany had packed up and left that day, and Chris took her to the airport to get on a plane to go to Toronto, Canada. So when Chris got back home, that's when him and his wife began to argue. And the next thing you know, he was found dead in the backyard by the patio with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, lying face up with a 9mm pistol next to his body. And Veronica called the police. His wife Veronica called the police, and when they arrived, she told them that Chris said he was tired of all this and just shot himself. And she also showed the cops all the medication he was taking at the time for his depression. And supposedly, he had also got a phone call from his accountant right before about a new tax bill he also owed. Now, one of the cops had put out a statement saying they were arguing about the divorce, and it came up that he owed the IRS money. And that's when he went out to the backyard, got his 9mm gun, then fired. But here's the crazy part though. Now, there were two movers. Like I said, the moving guys was there. There were two movers that the cops didn't question. And there was two nannies at the house that the cops didn't question. Now, according to the movers who were going in and out the house while moving things into the trucks, they said Chris and his wife Veronica were arguing and fighting upstairs, and then she came downstairs and said he had shot himself, but he was found dead outside by the patio. Chris was a big guy, 6'2", 220 pounds. So family and friends wants to know how Chris ended up outside in that backyard. And by that time, everybody had pulled up by then to the house. Family members had pulled up when they heard the news. His friends, families pulled up. Veronica family members were there. The crazy part is this. They say her ex-husband was already there. Busta Rhymes, Q-Tip. Everybody had pulled up to the house minutes later. But her ex-husband was already there before everybody. Now, his childhood friend Daryl from his crew, the Violators, and his brother Mike Lighty had to carry his body out because he was too heavy for the medical examiner that was on the scene to lift him. One of Chris' friends had showed up before the cops arrived, and the movers told him that they too were confused at how the shooting unfolded because they were inside and out the home moving things to the truck. Then it was reported that the two children that Chris and Veronica had, they had run to a nearby park to escape Chris and Veronica's argument. But that friend that showed up before the cops arrived said the movers told him that the kids were taken to the park after the gunshot. But there were all types of rumors going around, and many of his close friends and families just don't believe that he took his own life. Now, they ended up doing 2 autopsies on him. And on the first autopsy, the medical examiner ruled his death a suicide by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Then they found 2 bullet holes in his head, one when the shot went in, and the other hole was where it went out. And he was pronounced dead at 11:43 a.m. And by 6 p.m., a detective declared his death a suicide with no foul play. So basically, they investigated his death for about 7 hours. Then, his family got a second autopsy done by Michael Baden, who was a famous forensic pathologist who is known for his independent opinions on deaths. Plus, he has testified in several high-profile cases, including the O.J. Simpson trial. But Chris's family wanted him to test to see if Chris had gun residue on his hand if he took his own life. But the crazy part is the family never got the results from him. They never got the results from Michael Baden. Then 50 Cent said he don't believe Chris killed himself over money because Chris had just agreed to work with him on a tour deal worth $4 million. So 50 Cent hired a private investigator, an attorney named Scott Lehman, to launch a new investigation into Chris's death. And Scott Lehman said that the main problem that he encountered was that the NYPD did not do a thorough investigation into Chris' death. He wants answers as to why a gunpowder residue test was not conducted on Chris' hands, and he also wants a DNA test conducted on the weapon used in the death, something he claims was never completed. Plus, the medical examiner's office currently possesses a sample to initiate a test of Chris' hands and clothes for gunshot residue, but that test has yet to be conducted. And Scott Lehman and his team attempted to obtain the samples so it could be tested, but the piece of evidence has sat dormant in the office of the chief medical examiner. He said for months they have requested that the sample be tested and even offered to pay any costs relating to the testing, but their offer was ignored. He also stated that you would think Veronica would want to talk to them for this investigation to have this solved, but she has not cooperated so far, and he doesn't think that it's going to change. Wow. But Chris' mother and his family got an online petition for supporters called iPetitions.com for them to reopen the case. Now, Chris's wife, Veronica Lighty, told the media that her husband, Chris, who had made millions in endorsement deals for artists including 50 Cent, LL Cool J, and Missy Elliott, was suffering from financial stress. And there were also rumors about Chris and Veronica's rocky relationship before he died, because just a year before, in 2011, Veronica had filed for divorce, but retracted her original request for divorce as a Father's Day's gift to Chris. She had also put out a statement that her husband Chris was too smart of a man, he was a genius, and no smart man is going to leave his children for fighting with his wife. That makes absolutely no sense. Wow. She said they had a passionate relationship and they did fight all the time, but she and her husband had worked out their financial difficulties and that they were not getting divorced, even though she had filed for divorce, but retracted it 2 days before Father's Day. That was her gift to him. She also said they were not in debt for $5 million, but Chris did have a lot of weight on his shoulders. And she said, let him die proud, at peace, because that's what he wanted. Veronica's close friend named Norman Downs said he was in a lot of pain and he possibly had some financial difficulties, but he and his wife Veronica didn't get in the fight that day. The only person that really knows is Chris, and he ain't here. Wow. Now, in his will, which was created in 2007, it said that his entire estate was left to Veronica. And he also leaves a $1.6 million trust fund to his children. But people close to him said they were fighting a lot over cheating on each other and a bunch of other stuff. And there was a police report that indicated that Veronica was once abused by Chris. Back on August 28th, 2005, police responded to a 911 call at the Lighty residence. When they arrived, they discovered that Chris had split Veronica's lip open with his fist and left numerous bruises on other parts of her body. Chris was arrested and charged with battery, but Veronica declined to pursue the case. But a lot of his family and friends didn't care too much for his wife, Veronica. Chris's mother said Chris needed medical attention more than once, like the time when his wife Veronica had broken a champagne bottle over Chris's head. And his mother also feels the city did not do a thorough enough investigation with this case involving her son, because there were 2 movers at the house that day that were not questioned, and there were 2 nannies at the house that was not questioned. Now, Chris's daughter Tiffany said she had witnessed fights where his wife Veronica would try to make him hit her so she can call the cops on him to get him arrested. She also heard Veronica tell Chris, "Weren't you suicidal last year? Why don't you go and kill yourself?" And she also witnessed her hit Chris in the head with an object that left him with a big knot on his head. Now, Chris's brother Mike Lighty feels that Chris was murdered because his theory was this. He believes that after Chris took his daughter Tiffany to the airport that day, Veronica didn't think he was coming back to the house. She probably thought he was going straight to his office. But when Chris came back to the house, an argument took place, and he believes Chris was murdered because Veronica and her ex-husband were the only 2 people to be at the scene. And why didn't the cops investigate them for gun residue on their hands? Wow. That's what Mike Lighty thinks what happened to his brother, Chris. He said her ex-husband happens to be the first guy on the scene. So if her ex-husband is the first guy on the scene and she's saying she was the only one there, why weren't their clothes, their hands tested to make sure this wasn't a murder? Now, also, Mike Lighty stated that after he helped put Chris's body in the ambulance, the nurses told him that Veronica said that the family didn't want an autopsy. Wow. But then you got some that say he was stressed out. Some people say Chris was stressed out by the entertainment business because his life was attached to the success of his clients. Plus, he had a lot of people he had to take care of. He had borrowed a $3 to $6 million loan from Warner Music in 2007 to start his company called Brand Asset Group. But the company failed to produce the success he was looking for, and the loan was due on August 22nd, 2012. And 8 days later, he was found dead in his home by a single gunshot wound to the head. Now, it was also reported that he owed $5 million to the IRS, but then other sources say he owed more than $300,000 to the IRS in unpaid state and federal taxes. They say the City National Bank had recently won a default judgment against him, claiming he bounced checks and ran up overdraft fees totaling $53,000. Now, his good friend rapper D Nice said Chris told him that he was so stressed that sometimes he feels like just jumping off a building, because a lot of people didn't know that just a year before, Chris had checked himself into a psychiatric hospital in Connecticut because he was dealing with depression and having suicidal thoughts. He was diagnosed with clinical depression. And it's just sad because Chris had just tweeted about Scott LaRock on the anniversary of his death, August 27th, 3 days before. Now, At Chris's funeral, everybody was there. LL Cool J, Diddy, Missy Elliott, Q-Tip, Russell Simmons, Busta Rhymes, Mariah Carey, many more. Even 50 Cent and Fat Joe ended up squashing their beef for Chris Lighty, because Chris Lighty had blood for both of them. You know, after his death, man, podcaster and former lawyer Reggie Osei, better known as Comeback Jack, had did a great documentary on Chris called Mogul, The Life and Death of Chris Lighty, in 2017, which is on all streaming platforms if y'all want to check that out. And you know, rest in peace to Comeback Jack. He died from colon cancer on December 20th, 2017, just 2 months after announcing he had been diagnosed with cancer. He died 6 months later after he released that documentary on Chris Lighty. Wow, that's crazy. You know, TV One had did a show on Chris called Celebrity Crime Files, which was good too. It's just sad, man, because Chris and Shakira Stewart were two of the most powerful music execs in the hip-hop community at the time. And both of them took their life the same way. You know, rapper David Banner had put out a tweet saying, when Chris Lighty and Shakira Stewart died, I was wondering if hip-hop was going to start talking about what's really going on, but we didn't. That's what David Banner said in a tweet. But you know, like I said earlier, man, I hope 50 Cent do a biopic on Chris Lighty's life. He should make it into a series, whatever. You know, 50 got that power to do that now. That would be dope if he did something on Chris Lighty's life. Or a movie. A movie would be great on Chris Lighty, because, you know, there's so much information on Chris that people don't know. I ain't even get to the bottom of it, man. There's so much information out there about Chris' life and what he has done for people. It's crazy. You know, I hope somebody put out a book about his life too pretty soon. Man, Chris was 44 years old, y'all. Only 44 years old. Rest in peace, Chris Lighty.